everyone, and welcome to today's session. I am joined by Danny Fitzpatrick, who is the author of the book Restoring the Lord's Day. Danny is a writer as well as a teacher at a local high school. Not local to me, but local to him. And I'm excited today to share with you about his book, again, Restoring the Lord's Day. And the reason why this book is really critical, I think, for our time is we have lost the sense, I wouldn't say all of us, but many of us have lost the sense of what this day is meant to be, a day of rest. And before we actually begin our interview, I just want to read from Exodus. So it's from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, either you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your work animal, or the resident alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And so with that ground in us to our topic today, Danny, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about yourself, and then what led you to just focus on the Lord's Day and seeking to restore it in the hearts of all those who read this book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Valentina. It's great to be here with you and just to participate in your wonderful ministry. Um, as you said, I'm a writer and a teacher. A lot of what led me to the book was my experience growing up in New Orleans. So I've spent most of my life here. I was born here. My parents and grandparents, going back a long way, are from this area. And so there's a kind of culture here that's very Catholic, right? And obviously, like many places where there's like a traditionally Catholic culture, it's not the same as it once was. Very different, but there's still a way that the way that our society thinks about time, especially here in New Orleans, is very shaped by the life of the church. The most obvious example of that, I guess, would be Mardi Gras, which to most people probably does not sound like a very religious time, and certainly in some ways it's not. But what's wonderful about it is that it's kind of a perfect example to me of festivity, which is something that we've really lost. Um, a lot of times when we have sort of festivals or fun even today, it's become sort of manufactured and sort of commercialized, whereas Mardi Gras, and there are elements to that in Mardi Gras as well, but Mardi Gras is just a time when the whole city is like, we're going to take a break, we're about to go into Lent, and we're just going to have fun together as a people. We're going to come out in the streets and we're going to celebrate, and we're going to recognize that we're about to enter into a kind of time that's different from normal. We're not going to be going about our business in just the same old way. And we're going to treat things a little bit differently because of that. And that's very, very different from what I've experienced when I have lived in other places. So I did my undergraduate work in Dallas. I spent a year in Tampa. I spent a few years in the Little Rock, Arkansas area. And when I was in Little Rock, I worked in the car business. And that was kind of, to me, that was a lot of fun in a different way, but it was something that really showed me how I think a lot of people end up kind of spending their time, which is basically just spending their time the same sort of day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out. It felt to me just like every day was just a repetition of the last one, right? And there was no more sense of we're going to have different liturgical sorts of seasons to the year, which to me, so I felt that much more when I was away from New Orleans, right? And being away helps me to kind of think about, okay, what is it about New Orleans that's different? But I also recognized that the festivity that I had experienced in New Orleans was, while it was wonderful, it still was not sort of shaping my heart the way that I knew authentic celebration of faith ought to. So as a child, especially, I grew up in a very Catholic family. We went to Mass every Sunday in a really beautiful church in downtown New Orleans, Immaculate Conception. And even then, being surrounded by so much beauty and such a faith-filled community, I noticed that I felt anxious a lot of the time, especially on Sunday. And I think it was just because, after Mass, we'd go home and we'd have a nice meal together. But then I would start to think about, oh man, I've got this homework I have to do, and I've got these tests coming up on Monday and Tuesday, and um, other things too. Like, I have to have a conversation with a teacher that I'm not particularly excited about. I'm thinking about, what my friend said to me on Friday that kind of hurt my feelings, and now I have to see that friend again. So there were all these sorts of things that were making me feel just stressed out on Sunday. And I think part of that is just being normal and being human, but there was something inside me that was saying, this is not how Sunday is supposed to be, right? It shouldn't be just that uh, you go to Mass, but then the rest of the day is just about being stressed out about what's coming up the rest of the week. It should be that this day is kind of transforming everything else, or at least that's the way it seemed to me, right? That if the Mass was what it was supposed to be, right, this moment of contemplative union with Christ, culminating in receiving His body and blood, then there ought to be something that really transforms the rest of life coming out of that. So a lot of the book came out of just a desire to kind of live Sunday better, to figure out, like, what am I missing? What is it that's making me so anxious, especially on Sunday? And is there something that can be done to change that? And not that just like, if you're anxious about something, you're failing at life or something, but to really try to figure out a way to let the joy of the Mass sort of flow over into everything else.
Yeah, and actually in your book you mentioned, like you said, the Sunday scaries.
Yes,
And my husband and I had this conversation yesterday, just with his work schedule changing all the time. He was like, "Oh, I have 36 hours before I have to get ready for work tomorrow." And I was like,
yes,
"Oh my gosh."
yes.
It made me think of what you like your book, Sunday Scaries, and just how like our anxiousness and how it ends up pulling us away from the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
And in your
Mm-hmm.
book, it's just really beautifully written, by the way. Like I was blown away by the poetry of in which you write, the poetic way in which you write.
Thank
And
you.
you bring in a lot of the classics, and you talk about Saint Augustine and his perception or his commentaries on time, which you alluded to a little bit earlier, but and how we're constantly being pulled away from the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit in reference to the Lord's Day and why it's so critical for us to be grounded in the present?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because that to me is kind of I think that's the key insight of the book, is that Sunday is about turning our attention to God, and so much of just being human in general, but then the particular elements of modern life is kind of keyed toward pulling us away from that presence to God. So yeah, in the Confessions, Augustine makes he brings up this discussion of time. And so I think the first time I read the Confessions, which was as an undergraduate, I kind of glossed over those sort of ending sections of the book, partly because it's where it's kind of past the conversion story, the stuff that I think really moves people in a kind of immediate way, and he's getting more into this sort of abstract philosophizing that at the time I was like, okay, I don't know what you're saying right now. So I came back to it a few years later, and I was really struck by these passages where he starts to reflect on time. And he says that time is nothing other than a distension of the mind. Time is this being drawn back by memory into the past, being drawn on by anticipation into the future. He calls it this sort of triple negativity, right? The no longer of the past, the not yet of the future, and the non-extended moment of the now, right? That's always passing away. And he says that so much of our anxiety emerges precisely from our experience of time, right? That it's because I'm thinking about, what, that sin I committed last week, right? Or what somebody said to me last month, or I'm scared about the bill I have to pay at the end of the month, or the test I have to take next week. All of that just pulls me out of the present and doesn't allow me. And the really critical thing for Augustine is not just that it's taking us out of the present, because of course it's possible to make yourself be in the present through, like, you can use alcohol or drugs or all sorts of things to keep yourself in the present. But the critical thing for him is that real presence is not just living in the now, but it's being present to God. It's sort of giving our attention to the eternal now, out of which God is always living and into which he's always calling us. And Sunday is meant to be that moment when we kind of, because we do get drawn apart in time, right? And that's the way that God made us, right? It's not a bad thing that we have memory and anticipation. All of that is part of the way that God designed us and created us. But the key is that Sunday gives us this chance to withdraw for a moment, right? To let ourselves attend to God, give our attention to him, return his gaze that he's always directing to us with love. And out of that, learning to kind of do the same thing all the time, right? To learn to kind of pray without ceasing, right? To always have our minds and hearts lifted to him, which is so difficult to do, I think, in any age, but is, I think, especially difficult to do now, because we have so many things that make it even easier for us to not be in the present than would have been the case, 100 or maybe even like 20 years ago. And I think that is so critical to why Lord's Day observance has declined so much, and why there's so much anxiety in our culture. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, speaking of that, you share a little bit in the book about the not I won't say that the how do I phrase this? The way technology constantly pulls us out of the
Hmm.
present moment as a form of distraction, but that not
Hmm.
all technology is bad. And you share a little bit about the root of the word techne, and um,
Mm-hmm.
I guess if you can just share a little bit about why technology, the good and the bad, and how that influences more of the Lord's Day and our observance of it.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, techne, the way that the Greeks think of it, someone like Aristotle, is basically like craft or making, right? So, in some sense, right, anything that we make, whether it's like more manual, I mean, whether it's like a chair or a desk, or whether it's like fine art, a painting or a symphony or anything like that, is a form of making, right? Of, applying our minds to the material of the world in order to create things that serve some purpose. Um, the thing that has kind of, so Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, takes the sort of Greek understanding of making, and then looks at how is that different from the way that technology, right, has come to kind of exist in the world. And the basic distinction he makes is that um, art and craft tends to like work with the nature of a thing, whereas the technological kind of exists in order to create what he calls a standing reserve of something. So he uses uh, this kind of basic example of like a bridge versus a dam in a river. So a bridge, right? It kind of works with the river, right? You have to construct it in such a way that it can go across the river. It can be strong and yet flexible to some degree, and it creates this kind of beauty to it, right? There's this sort of loveliness to a river with a bridge over it, and you can walk across it and observe the beauty of the river. Whereas a dam, he says, exists to create a reserve out of that river, right? So it's taking the river and transforming it into into energy of some kind. Again, that's probably not. I think Heidegger would say that that's not necessarily an evil or something. Obviously, dams and other such technologies do a lot of good. But what becomes the problem, and here I think John Paul II sheds a lot of light on this in his encyclicals going back to Redemptor Hominis. The problem is that when the things that we make suddenly kind of turn on us and are using us as this reserve of energy, basically to feed themselves and to feed profit. So, I mean, John Paul II, and I think he's thinking especially of the dangers of nuclear warfare and things like that. Talks about how man is now in this position where he stands to be destroyed by the things that he's created, which is of course quite very true and quite frightening. But also in smaller ways, like, so I mean, my smartphone, right? It has this incredible power to sort of rely upon me, and it's kind of constantly calling to me to look at it, right? It has all these nifty ways of saying, "Look at me, spend time with me, direct your attention to me," and then it's also designed. I mean, the way that just phones are made and sold to us, right? They're kind of meant to. Like, I'm basically one of the army of people who's supposed to get another iPhone in 2 years, right? And Apple has kind of done this marvelous job of making sure they have this standing reserve of people who are always going to buy their product, right? And as soon as they bring one out, they've got this whole army waiting just to get it. Again, like, so there are people who kind of say that sort of technology is just sort of like fundamentally flawed. And I think there's some truth to that. Although, like, I'm very glad that, like, you and I can have this conversation right now. So there's so much good that's being done, and I think there's a really interesting space right now of, like, seeing the ways that Catholics and other people of faith and of goodwill in general are approaching the sphere of technology and doing good in that space. But yeah, I mean, I know just, and again, so much of what I'm saying, I'm just kind of searching my own heart for ways that I'm struggling. And I can say for sure that my phone is something that makes it really hard for me to be present. I mean, certainly to be present to God, right? And because it's much easier just to, scroll around on Facebook or Instagram or whatever than to, uh, you know, set time aside to pray a rosary or do something like that. But also to be present to, like, the things and people around me, right? Like, it's very easy to just kind of get distracted from my children, my grading, my wife, right? Anything else that sort of deserves and calls for my attention as part of God's providence, part of His will for my life. Things like a smartphone make it very easy just to ignore those things.
So actually, I'm glad you went in that direction. I wanted to bring up another key point from your book where you say that a lot of what we struggle with as a society, as a people, is acedia. Am I saying that
Hmm.
right? Acedia?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And sloth, and how it's not a sin that many of us think about, and
Mhm.
not one that we think that we would have. But you define it in a way that I think is very just insightful. And you share a little bit about how the early desert fathers defined it. So I'm going to read from there. And you are actually pulling in from Heather Hughes, and where she says the fourth century desert Christians told stories about slothful monks who did works of mercy in order to distract themselves from some greater good of prayer or service which they had come to abhor, and how even during the day that they would leave their cells to just look up at the sun and wonder when when this time of prayer would be over, or wonder why other monks didn't come visit them, or just anything to pull them to distract themselves from actually praying. And so, can you talk about that and how, and just I guess connected to what you just said about how even our smartphones pull us away from the very thing that God is inviting us to enter into more deeply.
Yeah, for sure. So this kind of goes back to my undergraduate days when, so I was reading a lot about sloth, or acedia, right, as it's sometimes called. And I was really struck by the way that, like, I started reading about these desert monks, and it was really astonishing how much what was being said about them I felt like applied to me. Like, it's, you would think, what could a fifth century guy living in the desert, right? What could his experience possibly have to say to mine? But yeah, they describe this feeling of, so I mean, there's kind of this bodily level of sloth, right? Which I think that's how most people think of it, right? As sloth is laziness. And certainly that's a part of it, and it kind of emerges from a weariness. So, like, the monks often feel it. It's often described as coming up around noon, right? So you can imagine if you're living out in the desert, you've been working and praying since really early in the morning. It gets to 12 o'clock, and naturally you're tired and hungry and probably don't really want to do much of anything. The danger in it, and this is kind of going into St. Thomas Aquinas, is when it kind of spills over from the body into the soul, and makes us not just tired, but makes us feel sort of sad about what God desires for us. So with the monks, yeah, as you said, they'll those lovely lines about how they'll, like, go outside and just kind of like look at the sun, be like, please, like, when will this be over? Why hasn't Jim come over to talk to me yet? Right. And those are the things that really resonate with me, where, like, so many times I could find myself, like, I get to a certain point in the day and I just don't want to keep doing what I'm supposed to do. Like, I don't want to prep for class. I don't want to grade any essays, right? I want to just, like, go kind of stare up at the sky and be like, please let this be over. Or go find somebody who's also not teaching and be like, hey, do you want to just talk for 30 minutes or whatever? And there's so many things like that where, like, I can, like, I have some writing to do. Let me clean instead, right? The baseboards could really use a good scrubbing. Let me go run some errands. And again, like, and this is such a key part of the discussion, so many times what sloth tempts us to do is not a bad thing, right? Because it is good to take care of your chores and run your errands, and it is good to go talk to your friends, right? But it's not good to be sad about what God wants us to do, right? And that's so much of, I think that is such a great part of the challenge, is, like, it's very easy, I think, especially for people who have had some kind of encounter with God, who want to serve him, who want to do great things for him. It's really easy to forget that so often doing the great thing is just doing the very mundane, almost boring thing, right? And I think we're kind of at a stage in the church too, where it's very easy to think about, well, like, I could be such a great saint if, my pastor gave better homilies, and if the choir was better at my church, and if the architecture and art was all just right. And I support all of those things. I support great homilies and great music and great art and architecture. I think those things are really critical to forming the soul. But it's easy to forget that God has put me here in this place and this time. He's given me this wife, these children, this pastor, these singers. And somehow these are the materials that he's asking me to be a saint with, right? And it becomes, I mean, sloth kind of preys again on taking my attention away from God, and directing it to other things, maybe primarily myself. But when we keep our attention focused on God, right, and that, again, that's kind of the whole thing with Sunday, right, is that it trains us to keep our gaze on God. That makes it so much easier than to see just how he's using the simple job he's given me, the simple tasks of feeding children and changing diapers and all these things. Simple task of uh, engaging with my neighbors, right? All these sorts of things. That's how he's calling me to holiness, right? And there might be other things that he wants me to do too. There might be changes that he wants me to make, cultural shifts he wants me to contribute to, but fundamentally, the people and places that are part of my vocation, uh, these are how he wants to make me holy.
I was just thinking about that yesterday at Mass. The gospel reading was Jesus saying, "Go out into all the nations and spread the good news." And I have a missionary spirit within me where
Mm,
I love meeting new people of different cultures and just wanting to just share the gospel with everyone. And I get really
yes,
excited about this, and I'm like, "Yes, Lord, send me. I'm the one." And then I'm like,
yes,
"But wait, within my current state of life, like that's actually not possible for me to like leave everything. I mean, I'm married and I have a baby. To be like, let's
yeah,
go and serve in Uganda." Um, and so I was like, "But Lord, like this desire that you placed in my heart, like how can I fulfill it?"
mm,
And then just without skipping the beat, the Lord was like, "Well, you could preach the good news to your child. You could teach him about
yeah,
me and your husband and the people that I bring to you, like in within your sphere of influence." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, but Lord, but that's all more fun. Like
yeah,
this is more fun. I want to go home.
right,
It's harder."
yeah, yeah.
So
That's so beautiful. Yeah, that's
it
his
was,
way.
yeah, yep. It's like, well, no, just right here.
Yeah,
So if you could just share a little bit more about like, so what do we do? I mean, you touch on it in your book, but I would just love for you to just bring it out for our audience. Just so okay, for us to honor the Lord's Day, we're called to be present. We're called to orientate ourselves to Him. So then, does that mean okay, we for sure go to mass, but then we just hang out and chill at home? Like, what does that actually look like, and what is the Lord actually inviting us to?
yeah. So one of the things that I found really interesting about this book was so it was kind of the first time that I had gone through the Bible with like certain specific questions. Um, like things like, okay, what does God kind of tell us in Scripture about how do we do this, right? How do we start to live His day differently? And so I think there's so much we can glean just from the Gospels and from Acts about okay, how did the first Christians sort of approach this day? And one of the things that's really striking is so especially like we see St. Paul, he kind of maintains the Sabbath and then the Lord's Day. Right. So we'll often see him when he goes to different places. Like he'll go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he'll preach and he'll discuss the scriptures throughout that day. And then the next day on Sunday, he'll celebrate the Eucharist. And I think that model, right? I mean, obviously, most of us are probably not culturally Jewish, and so probably are not observing the Sabbath in the same way. But I think that model of okay, making Saturday right a day of preparation for the Lord's Day is so important. There's kind of an analogy, I think, with the way that our culture treats football. So, like, we're kind of so during football season, and maybe part of this is just like working at a boys' high school, but it feels like we're living in game day all the time, right? So, like, the NFL is so great about promoting Sunday, right? I mean, everybody's watching football, and but it's not just we're not just excited about football on Sunday, right? Because Saturday is college game day, uh, Friday, right, is high school football. Usually, there's Thursday night football, there's Monday night football, but there's also analysis going on. So, like in the cafeteria here at school, they've got ESPN on, and just all day long, right? It's sports, it's football analysis, right? We're watching highlights, and we're studying film, and we're seeing what went wrong. Um, and there's like as overwhelming as that is, I feel like there's kind of a model in that for what living in the Lord's Day all week should look like, right? That um, it shouldn't be kind of, as you said, like it's not just, okay, we go to Mass and then we kind of do nothing the rest of the day, right? But I mean, Sunday should be a day that flows over into every other day, right? So that maybe Saturday we're reading the Mass readings ahead of time, right, and discussing in families or with friends. Yeah, like what is Jesus trying to say to us in these scripture readings, right? Why does the church give us these for tomorrow? Um, the rest of the day, Sunday, of course, spending time with family, right, but also having other times for prayer as well, right? Discussing the gospel, discussing the homily, thinking about the Mass together, um, sharing good things with each other, right? Whether that is a good meal, or whether it's doing works of mercy with each other. So the early church had a pretty strong tradition of doing charitable works on the Lord's Day, um, and I think otherwise doing things that help us to be present to God, and help us to kind of learn to feel God's rhythms at work in the world. So I think spending time with things like nature and art can be really, really powerful in terms of helping us to be present to God, because they tend to be the sort of things that help us learn to live in time well, right? So, I mean, observing nature can be so powerful for helping us not to be anxious in time, but helping us to see the way that uh, nature works in these providential cycles that help us to sort of see God's work sort of continually in the world. Looking at art too or listening to good music can be such a powerful training in sort of gathering up time into the present. So, like, I mean, obviously, if I didn't have my memory or my ability to anticipate things, music would make no sense, right? There'd be no way I could even fathom something like music, right? So, learning to listen to good music, right, trains me for using my memory and my anticipation in the sort of one contemplative act that trains me for something like maybe what viewing the face of God for eternity might be, right? So things like that um, teach us how to kind of lift time up to eternity, and how in the midst of time to be present to God and to feel Him at work in the world. All those sorts of things, I think, are sort of positive steps that we can take toward uh, treating Sunday well, but then learning to let Sunday flow over into the rest of the week, and to live always in the Lord's Day.
Yeah, I really, really like those tips. And so this was a few months ago. My husband and I were talking a lot about the Lord's Day and just wanted to have just to create traditions that and
Mm,
rituals within our family. And so we actually had a conversation, okay, like how are we going to live the Lord's Day? This was before I read your book. And one of the things we decided was, okay, in addition to Mass, we would for sure have like we love breakfast, and so
yes.
like have a nice breakfast together as a family. Like that's gonna be our priority, and then
Yeah.
also going on a walk. So we go on Sunday walks with
Mm,
our baby, and then we try to read some good literature together. And
yeah.
so that's like our keystones, like cornerstones. But I really like the idea of just doing works of mercy because that's not something that I would attribute naturally to think of doing on the Lord's Day, but it
Hmm.
makes perfect sense. You know, how else are we going to go out? We're like when at the end of Mass, where the priest is like, go out and spread the good news. Like, yes,
Yeah.
within the context of our family, it's good and beautiful, but like we're actually called to go out and like I think in the back of your book you mentioned you can invite another family over or
Hmm.
um, just bring a meal over to somebody's house, which is something that gets you outside of yourself and outside of
Yeah.
even your own family.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the works of mercy obviously vary so much according to like what your own state and your own family life is like, right? Because I mean, probably if you're, probably you don't want to be taking your family with young children, out to the homeless camp under the interstate or something. But you can still, like, as a family, you could, yeah, I mean, you could make sandwiches together that could then be given to people who do go minister to people on the streets. You can, of course, like, even if it's just in your own family, right? Even if it's as a parent, um, instead of, because I know for me, it's so hard sometimes to like, uh, kind of deal with the many distractions of having young children around, right? And it's so easy to just treat them as distractions, right? Or like, like you know, uh, I'm trying to write this book or something, right? And instead, right, I have to change this diaper. But especially I think on Sunday, treating those moments of what seem like distraction as in fact like this is what God wants me to do, right? And uh, here I'm, I have built in opportunities to perform works of mercy, right? To clothe the naked, right, and feed the hungry, who are my children, right? And it's, yeah, I think just approaching those little works, those little tasks with more attention to God, and so recognizing what a gift those opportunities are. Even that on a Sunday, right? Just adjusting our attitude, just reorienting the little things we're doing with attention to God can make such a difference uh, through that day and through the rest of the week.
I love that. That yeah, that's giving me good food for that. Um, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, as we wrap up our conversation today, Daniel, I just want to, if you can share a little bit about silence. That's something that we haven't
Mm,
yet touched on, but just how that is critical in us really entering into the Lord's Day more deeply.
hmm Yeah, it's so important, and it's. I think silence is probably something that's been hard for people to find in most times and places, but I mean, especially now, it's so hard to have silence. And even if we want to go beyond like just kind of silence as an absence of sound, but silence as an absence of distractions, it's so hard to find spaces where we can have that. I came across this line from Kierkegaard the other day where he talks about, it's such a telltale sign of our age that the only use it has for solitude is to punish people, right? We pretty much only use solitude as a punishment now as a culture. Um, and yeah, there's so much of kind of the work of the heart and the spirit has to take place in silence, because number one, I think it's in silence, it's in quiet, of course, that we're able to, number one, sort of redirect our gaze and our hearts and our attention to God, and try to listen to Him. But it's also a moment when, as I try to attend to God, I start to become more aware of what is going on in my heart, right? And it's so easy to get distracted from that. It's so easy to kind of ignore the conversation that I need to have with God in my heart by just looking at what's going on online, what's happening on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. Um, so going off into silence allows me to, and sometimes it's very uncomfortable, right? It can be a lot of times I just don't want to have the conversation with God that I need to, because it's going to take some honesty, and it's going to call me to do things differently. So sometimes I don't want to do that. But also, right, going off into places where we can have silence is often so helpful, right? So a lot of times, of course, if we want silence, we need to go someplace like, I mean, maybe it's a quiet room in our house, like Jesus recommends, but maybe it's a chapel, right, where of course we can have some quiet and be face to face with God, but also in nature, right? Nature is one of the places where we can have quiet, right? And we can learn to hear God's rhythms in the world, right? Because I think that's so often what we're lacking, right? We kind of get attuned to the rhythms of the world, like not the world as creation, but the world as what kind of society has concocted. Um, and it's really important to, because I can find myself just working for the weekend, right? Where kind of everything is driven by, let me just get to Friday. If I can make it to Friday afternoon, I'll be okay for another week, right? But instead, right, learning to be aware of the rhythm of God's plans, the rhythm of sort of the divine music that's at work, ordering things and bringing new life. And it's only in silence that I can come to hear that again.
Yeah, it is so true. I mean, just thinking about how Elijah heard
Yeah,
God in the stillness, right? It
yeah,
wasn't in the noise, it was in the stillness. And so
hmm
that's how we'll hear the Lord and be able to gain direction for our lives, but also just encounter Him, right?
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but on that note, Danny, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this book and inviting us to just restore the Lord's Day and just showing us the beauty of how our lives well lived can be well lived as we do that, as we enter more into the Mass, as we enter more into the day that the Lord has given us as a gift to rest and be restored. So,
Yeah,
I guess before we wrap up, Danny, where can people find your book and any last words you'd like to share with us?
yeah. Thank you so much, Valentina. This has been such a great conversation. People can find the book at the Sophia Institute Press website. I think it's just sophiainstitute.com. It's also available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, places like that. If you have like a local bookshop, especially a Catholic one, there's a good chance they either have it or they almost certainly can get it there. Those would be the main ways to get it. The thing that I always like to kind of leave people with is, because I think it's very easy to get discouraged in this time, and there are so many reasons to be anxious. But one of my favorite passages, kind of in Scripture surrounding these issues, comes from John chapter 5, when Jesus is being questioned about healing on the Sabbath. And he says, "From the beginning until now, my Father is at work, and I am at work as well." Right? And I just always like to encourage people to remember that when Jesus says that, um, that now is not just a moment in the past. That now is God's now, where He's always at work, where Christ is always at work in our hearts, and always inviting us to labor alongside Him, to order things, to create things, to bring new life. And that's always available to us, even in the moments that feels like it's so hard to just get by. That God's now is right now, as always.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
Oh, well, thank you
Absolutely.
again, Danny, and thank you all for listening. And remember, when you say yes to God, you change the world. God bless you, and see you next time.